David Jenkins' life was a carefully constructed shell, functional on the outside but hollow within. 5 years had passed since the day that DNA test tore his world apart, revealing that the boy he had loved, raised, and called his son wasn't biologically his. Emily, his wife of 12 years, had confessed to an affair, and the betrayal had cut so deep that walking away was the only way he knew to protect himself. It wasn't an easy choice. The hardest part wasn't leaving Emily, it was leaving Ethan, a boy he had cradled as a baby, taught how to throw a baseball, and comforted through scraped knees and nightmares. Despite the anger and betrayal, a part of David still loved Ethan, even if their bond was not one of blood. But every time he looked into Ethan's eyes, he saw Emily's lies. It had become unbearable. David had relocated to Denver, leaving behind the suburban house with its white picket fence and the life he once dreamed would be forever. He started over with a small house on the edge of the city, a job managing a warehouse, and evenings spent crafting furniture in his garage. The routine brought him a measure of peace, though a gnawing emptiness lingered in the quiet moments. On this particular evening, he was sanding the edge of a maple coffee table when a knock sounded at the door. He glanced at the clock. Nearly 8 p.m. visitors were rare, and his chest tightened at the thought of an unexpected interruption. Wiping his hands on a rag, he opened the door, and froze. Ethan. The boy, now nearly a man, stood on his doorstep. He was taller than David remembered, with a leaner frame and sharper features. But the same intensity burned in his eyes, a mix of anger and desperation that David couldn't immediately decipher. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice tight. David's heart clenched at the word. He hadn't been called Dad in years. For a moment, he stood motionless, unsure whether to embrace Ethan or steel himself for whatever had brought the boy here. Before he could decide, Ethan stepped inside uninvited. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. David closed the door, his mind spinning. "Ethan, why did you leave us?" Ethan's words burst forth, sharp and unrelenting. He paced the small living room, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why didn't you fight for us?" "For me?" David faltered, his carefully constructed shell cracking under the weight of Ethan's accusation. "It wasn't that simple," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know the whole story." "You're right, I don't," Ethan shot back, his eyes blazing. "All I know is that you walked out and left me and Mom to pick up the pieces. Do you have any idea what that did to us?" David opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan didn't let him. "Do you know what it's been like for her?" he continued, his voice rising. "She's sick now. She's been sick for years. And you," his voice cracked, and he turned away, struggling to regain control. "You weren't there." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken pain. David stared at the back of Ethan's head, his own guilt threatening to consume him. "Sick?" he finally managed. "What do you mean? What's wrong with her?" Ethan turned, his expression a mix of anger and despair. "She has lupus. She's been fighting it alone while you've been here, hiding from your responsibilities." The words hit David like a freight train. Emily, sick. His mind reeled at the revelation. He hadn't spoken to her since the divorce was finalized, had deliberately avoided any news about her or Ethan to protect himself from the ache of missing them. Now, the guilt clawed at his chest. Ethan took a shaky breath and continued, his tone quieter but no less cutting. "We need help. Her medical bills are piling up, and I'm starting college next year. We can't do it without you." David's throat tightened. He wanted to tell Ethan he'd help, that he'd do whatever it took to make things right. But a voice deep inside reminded him of the reason he'd left in the first place, the lies, the betrayal, the DNA test that had turned his life into a nightmare. "I can't," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's face darkened. "Can't or won't?" he demanded. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room to a small safe tucked behind a cabinet. He retrieved a yellowed envelope, its edges worn from years of being handled, and held it out to Ethan. "What's this?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowing as he took the envelope. "Answers," David replied. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Ethan opened the envelope, pulling out a single piece of paper. His eyes scanned the document, and David saw the exact moment the realization hit him. Ethan's face went pale, and he looked up, his expression a mix of disbelief and betrayal. This can't be real," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "You're lying." "I wish I was," David said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "But it's the truth. I took that test after I found out about your mother's affair. She admitted it, Ethan. She admitted that you're not mine." Ethan's hands shook as he held the paper, the reality of the situation sinking in. "You left because of this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. David nodded. "I couldn't stay. Every time I looked at you, I saw her lies. I saw the life I thought I had falling apart. It wasn't your fault, Ethan, but I wasn't strong enough to handle it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan stared at the paper in his hands, his expression unreadable. David watched him, his heart breaking all over again. Finally, Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Does it even matter?" he asked. "You raised me. You were my dad. And when things got hard, you left." David flinched at the words, knowing they were true. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I can't change what happened. But if you want answers, if you want to understand, you need to talk to your mother, and your biological father." Ethan stared at him for a long moment, then stuffed the paper back into the envelope and turned toward the door. "I'll be back," he said, his voice cold. "We're not done." The door slammed behind him, leaving David alone in the quiet house. He sank into a chair, his hands trembling as he covered his face. The fragile peace he had built over the past 5 years had been shattered, and he had no idea how to put it back together. Ethan stormed down the quiet street, the crumpled envelope clenched in his hand. The night air was cool, but it did little to calm the fire raging inside him. He couldn't make sense of it. For years, he had clung to a singular narrative: his father abandoned them, walked out on him and his mother without so much as a backward glance. Now, this DNA test threw everything into chaos. It was late by the time he reached his car. He sank into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as he tried to steady his breathing. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with a text from his best friend, "Tyler, you good? Thought we were gaming tonight." Ethan ignored it. How could he explain this to anyone? Even thinking about it felt like trying to hold water in his hands. His father wasn't his father. His mother had lied. He glanced at the paper again, the sterile text glaring up at him. Paternity excluded. For a moment, he considered driving home, confronting his mother immediately. But a voice in the back of his mind stopped him, David's voice. "You need to talk to your mother and your biological father." The words rattled inside him like loose bolts in a machine. Who was his biological father? The question gnawed at him, along with a quieter, more insidious thought. If David was telling the truth, had his mother ever planned to come clean? Ethan didn't drive home. Instead, he parked in the lot of a 24-hour diner. The smell of grease and stale coffee greeted him as he slid into a booth, the envelope still clutched in his hand. He pulled out his phone and hesitated, his thumb hovering over the contacts list before finally pressing Mom. The line rang twice before Emily answered, her voice tinged with concern. "Ethan. It's late. Where are you? Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. There was a long silence. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about," he snapped. "David, Dad, he told me everything. About the test. About the affair. About how I'm not his son." Emily's breath hitched audibly on the other end. For a moment, Ethan thought she might hang up, but then she said, "Where are you? I don't want to do this over the phone." "That's rich," Ethan said bitterly. "You had my entire life to do this, and you never did." "I'll explain everything," Emily said, her tone pleading now. "Just come home, Ethan. Please." But Ethan wasn't ready to face her, not yet. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You explain now. Start with his name." "Ethan. His name." The silence on the line stretched long enough that Ethan thought she might refuse. Then, finally, she whispered, "Paul." The name meant nothing to Ethan, but hearing it still sent a chill through him. Paul who? He demanded. Paul Henderson, Emily said, her voice barely audible. He was a coworker. It was a mistake, Ethan. One terrible mistake. A mistake. The words twisted in his chest like a knife. You think that makes it better, he spat. You lied to me. To both of us. My entire life has been a lie because of your mistake. Ethan, I'm not coming home tonight, he cut her off, his voice cold. Don't wait up. He hung up before she could respond, the screen going dark in his hand. His appetite was gone, but he sat in the booth for a long time, staring out the window at the empty parking lot. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, the phone still clutched in her hand. Her stomach churned with dread. She had known this day might come, had feared it, even. But some part of her had clung to the hope that the truth would stay buried. She rose slowly, crossing the room to her dresser. Hidden at the back of the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old scarves, was a shoebox. She pulled it out and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were fragments of a life she had tried to forget, an old photo of Paul Henderson, a few letters he had written her, and a hospital bracelet from the day Ethan was born. Paul had been charming, with a grin that could light up a room. But their brief affair had been a whirlwind of bad decisions and unmet expectations. When Emily found out she was pregnant, Paul had been indifferent at best. David, on the other hand, had been overjoyed, already dreaming of baseball games and father-son fishing trips. She told herself she was doing the right thing by keeping the truth from him. David would be a better father than Paul ever could, she thought. But now, sitting alone in her bedroom, Emily realized that lie had cost her everything. The next morning, Ethan woke up in the cramped back seat of his car, the envelope still beside him. His neck ached, and his stomach growled angrily, but he ignored both. He had only one thought, Paul Henderson. It didn't take long to find him. A quick Google search revealed that Paul owned a small auto repair shop on the other side of town. Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he expected to find, or what he would even say. But something in him refused to let this go. He needed answers, even if they weren't the ones he wanted. The repair shop was tucked between a gas station and a strip mall, its sign faded from years of neglect. Ethan parked across the street and sat in his car for a long time, staring at the building. Finally, summoning his courage, he got out and crossed the street. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The air smelled of motor oil and rubber, and the sound of tools clattering echoed from the garage. Be with you in a sec, a voice called from the back. A moment later, a man stepped into view, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. He was older than Ethan expected, with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes. But there was something familiar about him, a resemblance that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Can I help you? Paul asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Ethan hesitated, his mouth suddenly dry. He glanced at the envelope in his hand, then back at Paul. I think you're my father. Paul froze, the rag falling from his hands. For a moment, he just stared at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he said, Emily. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. Paul let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. Well, kid, he said, his voice heavy, I guess we need to talk. Paul Henderson stood frozen in the middle of the cluttered repair shop, his jaw tightening as he processed Ethan's words. The boy before him had his mother's eyes but carried a guarded intensity that was eerily familiar. Ethan waited, fists clenched at his sides, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't known what to expect, but Paul's silence stretched long enough to fill him with doubt. Had this been a mistake? Emily never told me, Paul finally said, his voice low. The words were a hammer blow. Ethan's pulse quickened, and he struggled to keep his composure. She never told you she was pregnant? He asked, the bitterness in his voice barely restrained. Paul shook his head, leaning against a workbench as though his legs might give out. No. We weren't serious. I didn't think, he stopped himself, dragging a hand across his face. She said she was married. I figured that was the life she wanted. Not me. Ethan stepped closer, his anger bubbling to the surface. So, what? You just let her go. You didn't think twice about her or or the possibility of this. He gestured sharply to himself. Paul's expression hardened, a flicker of his own defensiveness rising. Watch it, kid. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me. Ethan snapped, his voice echoing off the walls of the shop. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you walked away just like he did. The accusation stung. Paul straightened, his eyes narrowing as he stepped forward. You don't get to come in here and act like you know me, like you know what happened back then. Then explain it. Ethan shot back. Because all I've got are lies and half-truths, and I'm tired of it. Paul stared at him for a long moment, his gaze softening as he took in the desperation behind Ethan's anger. All right, he said quietly. But don't think you're gonna like what you hear. Inside the small office at the back of the shop, Paul offered Ethan a seat, but the boy remained standing, his arms crossed. Paul sighed, pulling a chair out for himself and sinking into it. He rubbed his temples, the weight of the past pressing heavily on him. Emily and I worked together at a real estate firm, Paul began. It wasn't anything serious at first, just a couple of drinks after work, a few late nights. I knew she was married, and she knew I wasn't the kind of guy who'd settle down. But for a while, it was fun. Ethan's jaw clenched at the word. Fun. As if his entire existence had been a careless fling. Then, one night, she told me it was over. Said she wanted to work things out with her husband. I didn't fight her on it. I figured it was for the best. Paul's eyes met Ethan's, and his tone grew serious. I didn't know about you. If I had. Would it have mattered? Ethan cut him off. Would you have done anything? Or would you have just let her handle it like you did everything else? Paul's gaze didn't waver. I don't know, kid. Maybe I would have stepped up. Maybe I would have screwed it all up. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that I didn't know. Ethan turned away, his hands gripping the back of a chair. His mind raced, Paul's words sparking more questions than answers. The anger that had driven him here was still there, but now it mingled with confusion and an ache he couldn't name. What about now? Ethan asked, his voice quieter. What do you do now that you do know? Paul leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I don't know, he admitted. This isn't exactly something I planned for. Ethan laughed bitterly. Yeah, well, welcome to the club. The two sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling heavily between them. Finally, Paul spoke again, his voice softer. Look, I can't change what happened back then. But if you want to stick around, talk, figure this out, I'm here. Ethan's jaw tightened as he processed the offer. He didn't know what he wanted. Answers? Maybe. Closure. That felt impossible. All he knew was that he couldn't go back to the life he'd known, not without untangling the mess he found himself in. I'll think about it, Ethan said, his tone guarded. Paul nodded, as if he expected that answer. Fair enough. When Ethan left the shop, the afternoon sun was high in the sky, and the heat pressed down on him like a weight. He got into his car and sat there, gripping the steering wheel as the conversation replayed in his mind. He didn't feel better. If anything, he felt more lost than ever. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, and he glanced down to see a text from his mother, please come home. We need to talk. Ethan's gut twisted. He didn't know if he could face her yet, not after everything. But he also knew he couldn't avoid her forever. He needed to hear her side of the story, no matter how much it might hurt. He started the car and drove toward the house he had called home his entire life. The drive felt longer than usual, each mile stretching endlessly as he rehearsed the confrontation in his mind. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his hands were slick with sweat, and his chest felt tight. The house was quiet when he stepped inside, the kind of quiet that made the air feel heavy. His mother was in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up when he entered, her face pale and drawn. Ethan, she said softly, her voice breaking on his name. He didn't respond. Instead, he sat down across from her, his posture rigid. Start talking, he said. The truth this time. Emily took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you, she began. Or your father, David. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping our family together. Ethan's expression hardened. The right thing. You lied to both of us. You let him raise a kid that wasn't his. I didn't know what else to do. Emily cried, her voice rising with desperation. I made a mistake, Ethan. One terrible mistake, and I was afraid of losing everything. You lost it anyway, Ethan said coldly. The words hung in the air, cutting through Emily like a knife. She pressed a hand to her mouth, struggling to compose herself. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. Ethan didn't reply. He couldn't. The anger and hurt swirling inside him were too much to put into words. All he knew was that the life he thought he'd had was gone, shattered like glass, and nothing she said could change that. The silence in the living room was deafening. Ethan sat stiffly across from his mother, the weight of her apology hanging in the air. Emily's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly together. She looked fragile, but Ethan wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. You're sorry, he said finally, his voice low and sharp. That's all you have to say? I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover what you did. Emily flinched at his words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ethan, I know I failed you. I failed both of you. But please understand, I thought I was protecting our family. Protecting? Ethan's voice rose, his emotions boiling over. Do you hear yourself? You lied to me for my entire life. You lied to David. And now, you expect me to just, what? Accept it? Move on like none of it matters. Emily's voice cracked as she replied. I didn't know what else to do. I made a mistake, Ethan, a terrible mistake. But I couldn't undo it. David loved you, he adored you. I thought if I kept the truth buried, we could still be a family. Ethan laughed bitterly. And look how well that turned out. Emily reached for him, but he recoiled, standing abruptly. He paced the room, his mind racing with everything he had learned over the past 24 hours. What about Paul? Ethan asked, his voice colder now. Did you even tell him? Did he have a say in any of this? Emily's gaze fell to the floor, her silence answer enough. Unbelievable, Ethan muttered. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his hands clenched into fists. You didn't just betray David. You betrayed me. You built my entire life on a lie, and you thought you could get away with it. Emily stood, desperation etched into her features. Ethan, please. Don't, he interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Don't try to justify it. Don't try to make me feel sorry for you. You had years to tell the truth, and you didn't. You let me live a lie because it was easier for you. Emily's shoulders sagged, and she sank back onto the couch, defeated. You're right, she said softly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, Ethan, don't shut me out. I love you. No matter what, I've always loved you. Ethan's throat tightened, but he refused to let her see the cracks in his armor. I need time, he said, his voice strained. And I need space. Don't call me. Don't text me. Just, let me figure this out. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face as she watched him walk toward the door. Ethan, she called softly. He paused but didn't turn around. No matter what happens, you're my son. You'll always be my son. Ethan said nothing. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving her words behind him. Ethan drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring past him as his mind churned with unanswered questions. He thought about David, the man who had been his father in every way that mattered, and Paul, the stranger who now represented a part of him he didn't understand. Eventually, he found himself parked outside David's house. The small, unassuming home looked warm and inviting, but Ethan hesitated. What would he even say? Before he could change his mind, the front door opened, and David stepped out onto the porch. He spotted Ethan's car and waved, his expression cautious but hopeful. Ethan got out of the car and walked toward him, his heart pounding. Can we talk? He asked, his voice subdued. David nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat in the living room, the same room where Ethan had confronted David the night before. The tension between them was heavy but not as volatile as it had been. Did you talk to her? David asked after a long silence. Ethan nodded. She told me about Paul. She told me a lot of things. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And I don't know what to do with any of it, Ethan admitted, his voice cracking. She says she thought she was protecting us. But all she did was destroy everything. David's gaze softened. Ethan, your mother made choices that hurt both of us. I won't defend what she did. But she wasn't the only one who made mistakes. Ethan frowned, confused. What do you mean? David sighed, his eyes filled with regret. When I found out the truth, I ran. I was so angry, so hurt, that I didn't stop to think about what you needed. I should have stayed, Ethan. I should have fought for you. But I let my anger get the best of me, and I'm sorry for that. Ethan stared at him, the weight of David's words settling over him. You had every right to leave, he said quietly. Maybe, David replied. But you deserved better from me. You still do. Ethan looked away, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had spent years hating David for abandoning him, but now he wasn't sure what to feel. What happens now? Ethan asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. David leaned forward, his expression earnest. That's up to you, Ethan. I'm here if you need me, for whatever you need. I can't change the past, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be part of your future. Ethan nodded slowly, the anger inside him beginning to give way to something else, something fragile but undeniable. Hope. 3 months had passed since Emily's condition took a turn for the worse. The vibrant, determined woman Ethan once knew had grown frail, her battle with lupus reaching its final stages. The hospital had become a second home, the sterile walls and quiet corridors a constant backdrop to their final days together. Ethan spent as much time as he could by her side, their conversations shifting from heavy truths to quiet reminiscing. They spoke of simpler times, picnics in the park, bedtime stories, and the little traditions that had defined their family before everything unraveled. The anger that once fueled Ethan's heart had cooled, replaced by an aching understanding of her flaws and humanity. David visited often, sitting quietly in the background while Ethan and Emily talked. Though their marriage had ended in pain, David had made peace with Emily in his own way. He came not for her, but for Ethan, knowing his presence offered the boy-turned-man a steady anchor in a sea of uncertainty. On a crisp morning in early spring, the three of them found themselves in Emily's hospital room. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the bed where she lay propped up on pillows. Her breathing was labored but steady, her hands resting weakly on the blanket. "Mom, do you need anything?" Ethan asked softly. She shook her head, offering him a faint smile. "Just your company." David leaned against the windowsill, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Emily. "Is there anything you want to talk about, Emily? Anything we can do?" Emily paused, her eyes clouding with emotion. "I just want you both to know how much you mean to me. I know I wasn't perfect, I made mistakes, ones I'll regret for the rest of my life. But you were the best parts of me, both of you." Ethan swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom, we don't have to talk about this now." "We do," Emily said, her tone firm despite her weakness. She turned to David, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for being there for him, even after everything I did." David nodded, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I wasn't there enough. But I'm here now. We both are." Emily's gaze shifted back to Ethan, her expression softening. "Ethan, you're so much stronger than you know. Promise me you'll keep moving forward, no matter what." "I promise," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. Emily's breathing grew shallower as the hours passed. The nurse stepped in briefly, adjusting her medication and offering words of comfort before leaving them alone again. Ethan held her hand tightly, unwilling to let go as the reality of the moment settled over him. As the evening shadows stretched across the room, Emily exhaled one final, soft breath. The steady beeping of the monitor fell silent, and the room was suddenly, achingly still. Ethan bowed his head, his tears falling freely as he held her hand. David stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "She was proud of you," David said quietly. "She always will be." The days following Emily's passing were a blur of arrangements and farewells. Ethan and David worked together to honor her memory, setting aside their differences to ensure she was laid to rest with dignity and love. It was a bittersweet reminder of how far they had come and how much further they had to go. One evening, as they sat in David's small living room surrounded by boxes of family photos and papers, David cleared his throat. "Ethan, I've been thinking." Ethan looked up from a stack of Emily's old journals, his brow furrowing. "About what?" "Your plans for college," David said, leaning back in his chair. "I know this has been a lot to deal with, but I don't want it to derail your future. You've worked too hard for that." "I'll figure it out," Ethan replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've got savings, and I can get loans if I need to." David shook his head. "No. You shouldn't have to do this alone. Let me help." He reached for a folder on the table and slid it toward Ethan. Inside was a check, accompanied by a neatly written note. "Dad, this is," Ethan's voice faltered as he saw the amount. "This is too much. I can't take this." David smiled gently. "Yes, you can. And you will. This isn't charity, Ethan. It's what a father does for his son." Ethan stared at the check, his chest tightening with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said finally. "You already have," David replied, his voice steady. "By letting me be here for you." Months later, as Ethan stepped onto the campus of his university, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. His mother's words echoed in his mind, urging him to move forward, to chase his dreams. David stood nearby, watching with quiet pride as Ethan took his first steps into a new chapter of his life. The journey had been anything but easy, but they had come through it stronger, bound not by blood, but by the ties of love and forgiveness. As Ethan turned to wave, David smiled and waved back, knowing that, no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. What would you do in Ethan's shoes? Share your thoughts about David and how he forgave his ex-wife and provided Ethan with money for college.